Hello and welcome to the Arctic Aurora Life Sciences Fund's monthly update for Arctic Aurora Life Science and Arctic Aurora Biotech Select. I'm Daniel Bolanovsky, portfolio manager in the two funds. With me today is Mark Fabian, our analyst. So for today, we'll, as always, cover the key events this month. We'll also cover, because of actuality, the market movements that have affected, in particular, biotech in this month. We'll also review the first Q4 results from those biopharma companies that had released numbers so far. We'll do a quick wrap up on some of the new products launched by biotech companies, and also a small special segment on an ongoing trend that is spin-offs of biopharma, particularly pharma companies with their respective businesses, which is an ongoing trend that we see in quite a few of these companies. So to begin with, January, as in the previous months, was quite heavily macro-driven. And again, interest rates hikes and the projections of number of hikes by the Fed in the US affected markets quite considerably. And again, biotech in general underperformed, although we saw weaker markets overall as well. Meanwhile, while Omicron fears was kind of diminishing, that actually affected some of the biotech companies negatively, particularly the ones that are developing vaccines and therapeutics for COVID-19. We'll get to that briefly by the end of the video. Pharma companies, on the other hand, is thought to be a safer haven in these rough market conditions, and that actually shown relatively clearly in January as well, where we saw pharma companies performing in general better than the overall markets. But going to biotech then. So we had a weak 2021. We were looking forward to sort of levels where we can see pickups in biotechs. Maybe we saw it by the end of the month, but however, going to that point in the last few days, and in January, biotech continued to underperform. So we have a graph in front of us here where the green line is the Biotech Select benchmark, actually, Nasdaq Biotech Index. That consists quite heavily of the larger biotech companies, whereas the purple line, XBI, the S&P Biotech Select Index, is an equal weighted index. And so therefore we see that the smaller cap companies affected that subsector quite negatively. So continued negative trend in the small and mid caps. We will also get to some of the rare exceptions in biotech, namely those companies that actually are nearing or at market with products. And we're following 3 launches in particular, where we had some actually positive indications, and those were 3 stocks that stood out positively. On the other hand, in terms of events in biopharma, we didn't see a lot of big market turning events, and perhaps that contributed a little bit to the negativity in the biotech sector. We didn't see any remarkable readouts. We didn't see any remarkable takeouts. So waiting for those events, and I think there will be plenty of them during the remainder of Q1 and certainly into Q2 as well. I think perhaps a lot of generalists are sort of standing by and even apparently selling out of biotech at this time. So looking at fund performance, that clearly, those for the 2 funds, those were clearly affected by this market movements. So for Arctic Aurora Life Science, yes, pharma helped to hold up performance during the month, whereas again, the small mid-cap biotechs was a drag to performance. In Biotech Select, clearly, that was an overall drag. Again, the larger caps held up much, much better than the small mid caps, but because we are heavily invested in the emerging biotech field, then that turned out to be a negative for fund performance during that month. So I mentioned earnings. A few companies have delivered earnings so far. We'll go through them quickly here. To begin with, Novartis did a relatively okay report, but I think in terms of expectations, people are looking for Novartis to take the next step in terms of the future growth, and guidance was in the sort of mid-single-digit level, and that was not enough to sort of convince investors. And we saw some negative reactions to that report. Novo had a relatively strong report. However, and we mentioned this in the last video, one thing that's overshadowing Novo's performance now is the manufacturing delays for their upcoming blockbuster drug Wegovy for obesity. We didn't get that much clarity onto when we see alleviation of those problems. We saw some clarity in defining what those problems actually were from the contract manufacturer that Novo uses. But I think the guidance is still mid this year when we see a supply going back to normal. So we'll just have to wait and see. If it's earlier than that, that will obviously be a positive for Novo. If it's later, then that will hinder the launch of Wegovy going forward. Danaher, the big LifeScience conglomerate, are having some tailwinds on COVID. Some of the businesses under the big Danaher umbrella are involved in, for example, COVID testing. So that's a positive for them. And that's been a pretty strong stock during January. J&J, broadly in line. Here we see headwinds on the medtech sector. And that's because that's affected by COVID and the rising numbers due to the Omicron variant, for example. Whereas the pharma units are performing quite strongly. Now, one of the key issues now for J&J is the consumer or direct-to-consumer product portfolio that J&J have announced that they will try to spin out. And more on that from Mark in just a little bit. I think from our perspective as pharma and biotech specialist investors, it's quite a positive thing because we see a pure J&J in that sense when they can focus more on the high-margin pharma business. Continuing on with some biotech companies, Vertex, a very positive report on their ever-growing cystic fibrosis franchise. Gilead, not so good, been one of the large cap losers, if I may use that term, during the month because of their weak report. I should say, though, that Gilead was post January, so it was early February numbers, by the way. And then AbbVie, with a pretty undramatic quarter. Some of their new inflammation products did perform slightly better, whereas the new product called Rinvoq is having some troubles. That's due to FDA guidance and labeling. That drug belongs to a drug class that have been facing some safety issues. And we've had some pushback from the regulatory side. So we mentioned J&J and their spin out. We have seen quite a few in the last few years of pharma companies trying to sort of purify their product lines. So Mark, maybe you can take it from here and see what's been happening up to now in terms of these spin outs and what we can see in the near future.
Sure. So as you mentioned, we wanted to highlight this trend that pharma companies are spinning out and separating their consumer health businesses, sometimes animal health businesses. So if we look at the history of this trend, the story started in 2014 when Novartis actually sold their animal health business to Eli Lilly. And then 4 years later in 2018, Lilly separated Elanco, combined with Novartis Animal Health, and they separated it in an $8.5 billion IPO. Then if we look at the next example, Merck, then they also sold their consumer health business to Procter & Gamble for almost $4 billion. And if we look at more recent news, Pfizer also combined their Upjohn business with Mylan to form Viatris in 2020. And then just very recently, Sanofi has also divested 16 consumer healthcare brands to Stada and also sold some other brands to various companies in, for example, Italy and Brazil. So if we move on and look at what's happening now, you mentioned GSK. So in 2019, they combined their consumer health business with Pfizer, and they had a joint venture. And recently, they announced that they would like to separate it from the core business so that they can focus on the more innovative, high-growth segments of the business. And Unilever already announced bids to take over that business unit. Although all the three bids so far, the largest being for £50 billion, they have been all rejected by GSK so far. Then up next, if we look at J&J, for example, the separation of their consumer health business is already underway. They will announce new leadership of the standalone company in the second half of this year, and the process is expected to be completed next year. If we move on to Novartis, they're reviewing their Sandoz business unit. It's an ongoing review, and they mentioned that all options are on the table to maximize value from Sandoz, which is valued at around $27 billion by investment banks. And Bloomberg also suggested that private equity firms BlackRock and the Carlyle Group consider a bid for $25 billion for that business unit. So it will be definitely interesting to follow these news on the companies and how they affect those share prices. So with that, I give the word back to Daniel.
Thanks, Mark. So interesting for us to see that purification of many of these pharma companies going forward, where, yes, they're losing cash cows, but are probably gaining in the more innovative and higher growth business. So back to biotech, because as I mentioned, it's been a weak month. And then we didn't have, and as I also mentioned, not many fundamental drivers in terms of news. I think the drag in the biotech companies were all due to, for example, outflows from ETFs and other sort of life science funds. So perhaps more interesting to look at the outliers, the companies that actually did develop positively during the month. And I think one common denominator among those companies were that they were early stage. So going from that, in some people's perception, the experimental stage, where now they're actually showing sales numbers. And that has been positively received by the markets because they are, at the very least, in line with expectations, and in some examples, they've been above expectations as well. So 3 examples to begin with: Albireo, a company that we've held for quite a while, in a rare liver disease called PFIC that affects people at young age. Now, sales have been just started. They just announced their first full quarter, or pre-announced numbers that were double their previous guidance approximately. Now still in absolute terms low numbers, so going from a guidance to 3 to 4 million to 6 to 7 million for Q4, but it's still a solid progress. Same with Mirum, a very similar drug actually to Albireo, similar company, rare pediatric liver diseases. And I think they are also showing that they're, it's a slow process, but they are certainly getting there, and the early indications are positive. BioCryst, a third company in a rare disease called hereditary angioedema. It's the first oral drug for this patient population. So quite a few drugs already approved in HAE, but they're all biologics. They all need to be injected or taken through IV. So in that, BioCryst's product, Orladeyo, is a significant step forward, for example, for the convenience of these patients in controlling the edemic attacks that these patients get. And I think launch has been pretty good so far. It's been a good holding for us in the last year. They had a slower Q3, so there was a lot of anticipation going into the full year numbers, and I think they are back sort of in line with expectation, but also delivered guidance that was on the very positive side. And so BioCryst is one of the few biotech stocks that actually gained market value during these months. And as always, while we're just hearing signals that the Swedish government is dropping most, if not all, restrictions due to COVID. We still have to mention, right, the COVID companies, and especially the vaccine companies that are not doing too well because of this. So one, the perception that Omicron, the new variant, is not as severe. And secondly, that we're sort of hopefully nearing the end of this pandemic, and that has hit market prices of the biotechs within COVID vaccines. So Moderna, BioNTech, and Novavax all saw serious depreciation in market value during this month. We saw also Pfizer diminishing a little bit during the month. So they obviously have large incomes from the COVID vaccine together with BioNTech. They are, however, launching their oral antiviral product, which will be important in the management of this disease going forward. But this is still early days, and supplies are actually a bottleneck for getting to patients at the moment. So they're still trying to ramp up manufacturing. So with that, we finally managed to include COVID as well in this monthly video as well. Hopefully, we'll see less and less of that going forward. So I think that's it for now. Again, I mentioned, I think where the news flow for January, was a little bit slow from the biotech side. I think we're expecting this to pick up in the next month. So hopefully we'll have some exciting trial updates, for example, in the February and March videos. So thanks for now. Thanks for watching. See you again next month.